right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. See a lot of people rolling in here. So we'll give it just another minute to see if things start to slow down a little bit. But while we're doing that, so I'll go ahead and kick off with some introductions. I want to welcome everyone to another episode of Inside the SOC. This will be our April Threat Landscape Report. I am Jason Barnheiser. I am the Director of Threat Operations, and I am joined by my peers here in the SOC. Jason Rathbun, he's our Technical Director of Threat Operations. Sam Decker is our Threat Intelligence Engineer, and Nevin Beal is our Principal MDR Analyst. So we've got a great lineup again for you this month to kind of go over, the various things the SOC is seeing throughout the threat landscape, and also provide a sneak peek of our annual threat report as well. So that was launched today live. And we're also going to be kind of discussing how the ATR ties into the things that we're still currently seeing in 2026 as well. So I see just about 150 people in here. So we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. As always, the Q&A is open. If you should have any questions, feel free to shoot those our way. We'll either try to weave them in live as we discuss, or we will, make sure we answer those via the chat as well. And then make sure you stick around, because at the end of this presentation, we'll have a little QR code that you can leverage for a potential free trial if you'd like. And then we'll discuss a little bit about takeaways and things like that you'll get delivered shortly after this concludes. So kicking off, these are kind of like the top three things we're going to talk about and focus on today. Last month was a heavy focus on like RMM and FakeCaptcha. So we're going to pivot just a little bit. We're going to talk about cloud compromise. It's another big thing that the SOC sees day in and day out. We're going to dive into kind of the various ways threat actors are compromising secured cloud environments and answer the question, is MFA really enough? Then from that, we're going to pivot to our partners directly, because Blackpoint partners very closely with the MSP community. We're going to talk about what happens when MSPs are the targets, not necessarily just their end customers, but the MSP partners themselves. So, partners provide security to their end clients, but what happens when you become the target of a sophisticated attack? And then, like I said, last but not least, we'll wrap up with some brief insights and stats from the annual threat report, and kind of weave that into our conversations overall. So for the rest of my team on the call, let's kind of do another quick wrap up on initial access and compromise. And if you joined the webinar last month, you'll notice that these three things are really the same. Some of the top three things that we are seeing still that allow threat actors to gain that initial access and compromise in an environment are still FakeCaptcha, SSL VPN, and rogue RMMs. So Sam, from like the FakeCaptcha side of the house, what are we still continuing to see be effective there? And how is this continuing to scale and grow across the threat landscape?
Yeah, I think, we touched on this a bit last month where, they're really not breaking the mold on a lot of these. They're using the same, we still see the same PowerShell, invoke web request, fake captchas, and a lot of the times they just work, right? They're still kind of like adapting and picking up different lulbins, but for the most part, they're really they're very just effective across the board, right? We're not seeing a ton of like crazy innovation on these. A lot of the times I was looking at one this morning that was literally just like invoke web request and like invoke expression, and that was it, right? And like it just works. Yeah. So
yeah, there's not a huge scale of like sophistication here, right? Like we're continuing to see the same things work with these FakeCaptcha type attacks because it really is just social engineering on a massive scale. And you can set up these watering holes on compromised legitimate websites and just continually get that kind of, inbound compromise by having those end users, execute as well. And I think the big thing that we're continuing to see around this is just the sheer number and types of rats and malware that are being deployed, right? Nevin, can you talk just quickly a little bit around like all of the different droppers that are being used in this tool set and how just about every threat actor seems to be catching the kind of FakeCaptcha bandwagon?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's more of it's a new novel piece of malware, a new piece of malware we can see pretty frequently in the SOC. So the sort of technique, as Sam mentioned, stays the same. They're leveraging that sort of fake captcha because at the end of the day, users are sort of the sort of vector that can be frequently abused, even if you have all the fancy security tools. All it takes is for one user to click that link or do something they're not supposed to sort of circumnavigate that portion. But for the pieces of malware getting dropped, we've seen rats, stealers. I think frequently the recent one's been net support rat. We've seen async, desk VB rats resurface, and then stealers as well. As it's more of the list goes on. I don't have them off the top of my head at the moment.
Yeah, right. But everyone's leveraging it, so it's almost like that list grows daily when we see this type of stuff. Yeah. So make sure you're taking a close look at that. But Jason, what is some of the ways that partners can quickly kill the kill chain for FakeCaptcha, and what are we continuing to detect on from a detection and response perspective?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Because we've talked about this time and time again with these fake captchas, and it's like, why are they still working, right? And part of that comes down to kind of how this functions itself is that it's drawing the user to use the run option to execute code. So it's typical social engineering. And where that changes is not necessarily how the fake captcha is there and how they're running the fake captcha, which is the run option. And you can actually disable that with group policy or local registry keys. It's the run option. Pretty easy. If you just Google, you can figure out how to disable it. And with GP edit, you can also turn it off there. And that'll disallow them from doing that type of execution, so they'll get stuck, right? But the reason it's still working is because the tactic isn't changing, but what comes as a result is changing, right? They're switching up, they're living off the LAMP binaries that they're utilizing. The web-hosted payloads are adapting. And this is really kind of why AV in general can kind of be, like traditional AV EDR can kind of be a losing game, because these threat actors aren't utilizing these payloads until they've tested them against these major AV providers and confirmed, hey, I know that when I swap my web-hosted payload, it's going to bypass all these different providers, whichever ones they've tested it against. And then once they see it stop bringing shells back, they'll update it again, right? So this is just a reliable way of execution that they've found into tricking users that are used to seeing these kind of robo confirmations and such.
Yeah, it's kind of like, threat actors right now are basically just throwing the kitchen sink at FakeCaptcha, right? Because just about anything works, and they have a limitless of supply in their tool set to continue to just rotate some of these, not necessarily advanced TTPs, but all of the things that they have access to by having that user do that direct execution.
That's why we're very set on like the tradecraft itself, right? Not necessarily looking directly into the file, but how is that file getting executed? What does that process look like?
Yeah. Awesome. Yep. So that's FakeCaptcha in a nutshell. Again, we've got a lot of blogs and things like that we've implemented on the Blackpoint side that kind of goes over some of these different attack chains. We've seen a lot of different stealer capabilities. So make sure you definitely keep this one on your list, and think about those different defense mechanisms to help shut down the total chain of attack there. The next two that are on this slide, we're not going to concentrate as much on right this second, because they are going to be captured in one of the kind of the incidents that we're going to go over today. But I do just want to make sure that everyone is still tracking that, like, SSL VPN abuse and rogue RMM abuse is still two of the top three things we see in the SOC day in and day out. That SSL VPN, again, think of that as kind of like your front door, right? Threat actors are able to say, I am user XYZ, with your legitimate credentials, and walk right into that SSL VPN. Same thing with rogue RMMs, right? A lot of our partners in the MSP space and MSPs throughout leverage remote monitoring and management tools to be able to do the things they need to do daily. Threat actors have realized that, and they've been able to utilize those same RMM tools to blend in with their surroundings and really gain that kind of like command and control without dropping malware necessarily, but by leveraging these rogue RMMs altogether. So these three things still kind of key are like kings of the hill when it comes to the SOC and what we're seeing day in and day out. So please make sure you're kind of checking these things. Is your SSL VPN secured? Is it publicly exposed? If it's publicly exposed, generally someone's going to find it. And if that isn't locked down, down, doesn't have MFA, doesn't have strong credentials, someone's going to attempt to kind of breach that. And then rogue RMMs are another thing. Make sure you have strong application controls and asset inventory management, so that way you understand some of those vectors and some of those things that could be latently hiding in your environment. Next up is timely, because I just saw the poll finished, and a lot of people saying, how do you believe attackers most commonly gain initial access today? And 83% are phishing and social engineering, which is perfect because we're getting ready to talk about BEC and AITM. And I know everyone kind of jokes in the industry that we have just as many acronyms, if not more, than anyone else. But we're specifically going to be focusing on business email compromise and how adversary in the middle architecture helps and facilitates that. So this is phishing and social engineering all rolled up into one, with a software as a service level platform to be able to be leveraged. So Sam, let's kick us off here a little bit, and let's talk about like business email compromise just in general for everyone, right? This is a booming business. It's a multi-billion-dollar, industry, according to like the federal crime reports. This is something that maybe doesn't make the news all the time like ransomware does, but it has just as damaging impacts to end customers and businesses, right? So walk me through a little bit here of kind of like what we're showing and what we're seeing as being some of those like tried and true call signs for business email compromise.
Yeah, I mean, from a social engineering perspective, the biggest things are like the urgency and legitimacy, right, of these emails. Like that email that we're showing on the left there, that OneDrive for Business of like a shared folder, right? User probably has no expectation of receiving that email, but if they click it, go there, the Cloudflare CAPTCHA, right, to kind of like give you a little bit more like kind of oomph of like, hey, this is legit. I'm doing the thing verifying I'm human before I get to access my document that was like shared with me. And then down on the bottom you can see if you look at the URL, you can actually see like, right, that's not a Microsoft login URL, but it's presenting that Microsoft login. And when we talk a little bit more about the adversary in the middle and kind of like how that works, right, it'll make a little bit more sense as to like why this is right. This is the Microsoft login page, right? It's not a fake one that's being spun up. What the adversary is doing is they're planting themselves in the middle and sending the request on behalf of the user to Microsoft. That response that they receive from Microsoft with the login page, all of those assets, it's then being translated onto this page, right? So this is actually a Microsoft login page, just not on Microsoft.com.
Yeah. And you are starting to see also defense evasion get involved here with these, because part of the reason that they're putting the Cloudflare reCAPTCHA there is so that those automated link filtering services, a lot of what they do is they'll actually go to the link and they'll like defang the email and such, but they essentially go to that site and try and validate what's on the other side, which obviously is an automation doing that. So if you put that Cloudflare reCAPTCHA in front of it from a threat actor perspective, now that link filtering service is hindered and it can't get to the site because Cloudflare is in front of it, right? So we're seeing them start some of this defense evasion in front also, that blocks that visibility from these link filtering and blocking services, because from the perspective of Microsoft or another type here now, they might not be able to get to the content and see that phishing site.
Yeah, and I also like to point out kind of like the social engineering of it all here, right? Like we've seen this a lot in the industry with like OneDrive and sharing files and that kind of stuff. But the other thing I like to point out here is in that bottom right image, we see that the user's account is already successfully filled out, right? They're taking that fish, they're passing this information along. And, this is one of our testing accounts, bruh, at Microsoft.com, right? But like at the same time, a user will see that, they'll see that their name is filled out, and we're conditioned to think that, hey, since my name's already there, I've visited this before, right? It helps to kind of disarm them a little bit and help them understand that like these things are necessarily more benign, because it tricks them into thinking that they've been there before. So when you couple a highly targeted email with a payload in it, these defense in depth capabilities plus the social engineering to make them feel more comfortable like they've been here before, that's where we really start to see this stuff work and ultimately trick the user into, putting these credentials in, enabling MFA, challenging and, all authenticating in, but while also, providing that stuff directly to the threat actor that's hosting these services. So, we're talking about adversary in the middle, and this looks pretty straightforward, but there's a lot going on the back end. So I wanted to pass it over to Sam to talk a little bit about like what is going on in the back end here and how does this infrastructure work when I have MFA deployed, I have conditional access deployed, but an attacker is still able to log in and bypass those controls.
Yeah, and this is something that kind of alluded to on the last slide, but what's happening is that it's exactly how it sounds, right? Adversary in the middle. They're sitting in the middle of the authentication flow. And so everything that, the user requests the Microsoft login page, right? So they're sending that request to Microsoft, we're retrieving that response and then relaying it to the user. So one of the things that is actually really interesting to point out is like, if you've ever played with any of these kind of like adversary in the middle fish kits, if you put in like, certain domains will have like a custom Microsoft login. If you try to log in as one of those users, that login page will actually be presented to the user in a lot of these fish kits. Like Evil Jinx is one of the ones that comes to mind with that, where like, if you have, for example, Microsoft.com, they have like, their Microsoft logo on it, whatever company that you're working for, whatever company your domain is tied to. If you have that like custom logo on the Microsoft login, because that's all configurable in M365. That's presented to the user, which kind of adds to that like familiarity of everything, right? That's how you typically log into Microsoft. You typically see that login page, and so that's what's being presented to the user. And then, from the multi-factor authentication flow, whenever, Microsoft requests that two-factor, that again request is relayed to the user. So everything is happening as though, the user is logging in normally, and the adversary is sitting in the middle, and they're just capturing that session.
Yeah. Yeah, and that session replay capability is really where the strength in these, phishing as a service and adversary in the middle platforms come into play. Is, we as defenders have secured these accounts because we've created MFA, but at the same time, the attackers, they're not giving up, right? They iterate and they create just as fast as we do on the defensive side. So it's important to understand how, an attacker can steal these token sessions and be able to kind of replay them. We continue to see this a lot throughout the SOC. Lots of different infrastructure is used as well when it comes to these servers. These are generally hosted on, less than reputable data centers and things like that. So Jason, can you talk a little bit about how, the SOC is proactively looking and hunting for these malicious data centers and how we come to identify these and then ultimately alert on these so that way we can help protect clients as well?
Yeah, for sure. We're reviewing a lot of these autonomous system labels as they come through, mainly checking to see, are they a VPS provider? Do they look like they're a bulletproof hosting provider, right? So we're investigating to see, like, is this DigitalOcean? Is this a Hertz server, right? Those are the types of things that we're looking at. We're also looking to see, like, what services are exposed on these when they're doing authentications, right? And then we have some behavioral analytics that come into play for users, because there are some users that or organizations that utilize these hosting providers in the cloud, right? But unfortunately, threat actors also really like to use these hosting providers in the cloud because it's essentially a drop server that they can just spin up in a location that they want to bypass conditional access and also bypass some of the VPN detections that people are doing, right? Because a lot of threat actors, what they used to do, and they still obviously do, is if they need to bypass conditional access, they'll use a VPN and just change their location to the United States or wherever that company is located, right? But as VPN protection or identification has gotten better and proxy identification has gotten better, they're starting to create their own servers, and then it's kind of like rolling your own virtual private server, right? So that's the type of thing that they're doing now. So yeah, we're looking very in depth into that and those providers that they utilize for that.
Yeah. But there's more, right? I feel like it's like those infomercials that you see late at night, right? Like adversary in the middle is something we have to worry about, but wait, there's more. So Sam, can we talk a little bit about what we're now seeing as this evolution of like device code phishing continues to evolve?
Yeah, this is a super interesting one. So like the way that it works is you can essentially request a verification code, right? So you're authenticating without username password. You can do this for any account. And so in this case, what they do is you'll see step one, the threat actor requests the device code from Microsoft, right, for whatever service they're trying to authenticate to. And then they actually take that and send that to the victim. So on the right, we have an example of what that email looks like. So the victim is then going to go to Microsoft and they're going to authenticate with that device code, right? And so this is kind of like a little bit different because with adversary in the middle, they're visiting attacker infrastructure, right? That's kind of like relaying Microsoft. In this case, the user is actually interacting directly with Microsoft. The threat actor is just the one who's providing them the device code. And so once they authenticate with that, it generates like an access token, right? And because the threat actor was the one who requested the device code, they can then go ahead and retrieve that access token and use that to authenticate. So it's, kind of the adversary, the only interaction that they have with the user is the email. Otherwise, the authentication and everything is happening from Microsoft, right? Users interacting with Microsoft, threat actors interacting with Microsoft. There's kind of like two different lanes here, and they're kind of parallel. And the only interaction is like, the threat actor saying, hey, go use this, right? And so I think this is a pretty interesting one to kind of like look at. We've started to see a pretty big uptick
With
in
these,
this.
the threat actor doesn't even need to go, or the victim doesn't even need to go to a phishing server, right? They just go to Microsoft/device login and put in the code that they got.
What's really interesting with these two, from our side when we're looking at these, it actually, the authentication, the initial authentication that we observe is actually happening from the user's device, right? Because the user is the one that's authenticating to Microsoft with that device code, before the threat actor then is able to retrieve that access token.
Yeah. Yeah, we've seen this a lot with hosting providers, right? One of the big ones that comes to my mind right now is Railway. It's a hosting provider that we've seen heavily involved with device code phishing. They're not doing it, but the attacker's infrastructure is hosted in Railway as a bypass here. That really makes it look like someone's logging in from the US. It helps to kind of bypass some of those other controls. And then when you look at these in the logs, you see the user's device as well. So, right, it's a user device. They're successfully authenticating, and they're authenticating from within the US. So it really helps to kind of help this stuff fly under the radar a little bit more if you're automatically dismissing things as benign because it's tied to a user's device, right? Like the user's device is actually what we're leveraging here in order to push that authentication and gain that access for that threat actor. So again, we're talking about next level, social engineering, but also at the same time, the threat actor is understanding how we are reviewing these things and how general defense is done with a Microsoft or a Google Workspace account. And then they're leveraging those kind of things to then pivot their infrastructure to continually bypass. So again, like we talked about, it's this evolution of always seeing threat actors play this cat and mouse game with us, where once we figure out how to catch them, they then pivot and try to find another additional means or method to bypass our detection capabilities. So, having a strong partner that's able to monitor these things, do user behavioral analysis live, and really understand what's going on with these identities and these accounts is key.
Yeah, I think that's why the autonomous system review, right, of these, when we see, where you mentioned, right, we're seeing the authentication from Railway, but from the user's device, and that's kind of where from our detection side, that's how we're able to catch these so effectively, right? Because we've been doing a lot of research into these different autonomous systems, different hosting provider sources, and so we know a user's device is not actually authenticating from a Railway IP typically, right?
Yeah, and I think the other thing I mentioned too is this can sort of tie in a FakeCaptcha, and threat actors leveraging legitimate features and functionalities of Microsoft. So again, device code login is a legitimate aspect of Microsoft. FakeCaptchas are using the run dialog box, which is built into Windows, and then they're leveraging Lobins off of that to sort of start the execution kill chain to deploy that rat, deploy that stealer. So it's an interesting psychology of, hey, let's just abuse what's already built into the product itself to see if we can get past detections.
Yeah, that's going to be a big theme in the annual threat report, right? So users or threat actors aren't breaking in; they're logging in, right? They're using things that are already at their disposal to create this sort of compromise. So once they get into an account, what does this generally look like, Sam? Like, what are we seeing once they get in order to kind of mask what they're doing, but at the same time achieve a form of kind of like persistence and exfiltration, similar to what we would think they would do when they gain access to like an endpoint itself?
Yeah, I think on the next slide we have some discussion on the exfiltration aspects. I'll focus more on like in here just on the financial gain, right? We stated here the attackers need some kind of return on their investment, right? So they're very often going to try to do some kind of financial fraud. A lot of the times we see like hidden folders, RSS subscriptions, RSS feeds, conversation history, some of the other like legacy folders that don't actually like show up typically when you open your Outlook inbox. The threat actors will like reroute emails to those folders. Things like anything that mentions we very often see things like specific keyword strings, so like finance, invoice, refund, things like that getting routed to those folders so that the threat actor can then review those and kind of like use that data, right? They're not going to like immediately use it, but they can kind of leverage that so that they're able to extort the user or retrieve sensitive information. They may then insert themselves into conversations, so like if they're looking specifically for mention of those kind of like invoices or payments or whatever, they can inject themselves in, and that's how we see a lot of like the like the wire fraud and stuff happen through these kind of campaigns, because they're kind of inserting themselves into those conversations with, they'll then add an external account into the email thread. So they don't even need access to the initial email that they've compromised anymore, because they've just inserted themselves. They found the conversation that they wanted to kind of like leverage, and then they insert themselves in there. So I think definitely like those hidden folders are the ones we see the most. Sometimes they'll do like specific users. A lot of the times we see the keyword kind of like filtering. We've seen sometimes too where they do like mention of like different IT things, like more sensitive kind of like, not even from like a financial perspective, just like IT keywords, like mention of phishing, because sometimes they'll use these accounts to then blast out phishing emails to other, every other contact. So they'll route like anything that mentions like hack, phishing, phished, fake, compromised, whatever. They'll route those so that the user, because the user doesn't know that that's happening, right? So if they start all of a sudden getting emails saying, hey, your account's compromised, right, that's going to tip them off. So they may route those to those kind of hidden folders as well.
Yeah, and the end user has no idea that they're phishing people, right? Because if you were to send me an email, Sam, that says, hey, like, I need you to log into this, that kind of thing, and I'm like, hey, like, I think this is phishing, what are you doing? That phish word in there immediately puts that into that hidden folder, so that the end user might be in their mailbox and they might not even see that this is going on. And it helps to kind of hide under the radar until they have the chance for that financial gain by kind of like swooping in at the last second saying, oh, by the way, our payment structure has changed, and now I need you to route that funds to, this account instead, right? The big thing about this is like with ransomware and extortion and all that, we hear about like shutting things down and extorting people for the data that was stolen. But, business email compromise also has a financial goal, right? Like threat actors aren't just doing this for the fun. They want to make money as well. So it's very important to understand how they need to make money and how they achieve some of this financial fraud and wire fraud in order to kind of, fulfill their goals, so to speak. I think the big thing with this one that I really want to point out is like, let's say MFA was bypassed initially here, but you say, well, I've got conditional access, I'm fine, right? Like it's going to block their US-based login. If you look over here in our alert details on the right, you'll actually see that this is a US, Illinois, Chicago-based geolocated IP, right? So now the threat actor has bypassed your conditional access by using this Namecheap VPN service that they probably paid crypto for. They're using a free trial to stay anonymous, and now they've bypassed those additional controls. And if you're not looking for these kind of things or monitoring this creation of inbox rule activity, you might not see this until it's too late. So, Sam, I did want to kind of talk a little bit more about like, what does this kill chain look like in full? And what do we generally see happen when it comes to exfiltration? But at the same time, where does Blackpoint kind of interrupt these things to help ensure that these fully fledged adversary in the middle attacks get stopped?
Yeah, so I think this was a good example of a different kind of phish kit that we don't typically see, right? We usually see things like like Axios being leveraged. This one was actually Azure AITM function like toolkit. It's like an open source toolkit. I know Nevin did like a deep dive on it, so if you have anything to add there, feel free to kind of like hop in. But we get alerted as soon as that authentication happens, right? Mm-hmm. We're looking at, again, we've touched on it a lot with the autonomous sources. We're looking at the source of those logins, the user behavior profile of where they typically log in from, how they typically log in, what device they're logging in from, what browser they typically use, what apps they're logging into. All of that stuff gets taken into account. And so when we see them logging into like an application that they don't typically log into, using a different browser, different kind of device, right? Those kind of things combined with, the fact that like they're now using a VPN, they're using a jump box from, a foreign country that has RDP exposed, right? Stuff like all of that stuff kind of tips us off. And then we start to see the follow-on authentications, but by that point we've already detected and flagged for like impossible travel. We saw the user this morning log in from the United States, and now all of a sudden they're in Switzerland, right? So something there's off, and we can identify those toolkits, kind of like tie the infrastructure together, and then we can go and threat hunt across our entire customer base, right? We now have identified this additional toolkit that's being used to phish users, right? Maybe we've done this a few times with like the autonomous sources, right? We maybe identify a new hosting provider we haven't seen before based on all of the other factors, right? And then we can go and we can kind of improve the fidelity of our detections across all of the other customer bases. And then to touch on the exfiltration part, right? EM client is a huge one because that allows them to exfiltrate all of the email and like their contact data, and kind of just give them another set of victims, right? So sometimes I mentioned sometimes they'll blast emails out from that compromised account. Other times, they just want to collect all of the contacts from that user, and then they'll go and do the same thing that they did to catch that user, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of like a twofold approach there.
Yeah. Jason Rathbun, you want to talk a little bit about like applications and how they can be used maliciously? We've talked a lot about kind of like initial access, compromise, and logins, but this is interesting to see how some of these device and application consents can be used maliciously, maybe fly a little bit under the radar, but then have a much larger impact overall on the account.
Yeah, definitely. So it's pretty rare that we see them create like their own enterprise application. What they typically do is they'll utilize enterprise applications that have legitimate purposes, kind of like we see them utilize RMMs and such in on-premise. They'll take like backup clients that essentially allow you to export your emails or like automate outbound emails. And they'll approve and consent to these applications from the compromised user, which essentially whatever permissions that application has, they still have those credentials, even if you go in and you reset like the password and clear out the sessions, because that application is still approved, right? So they'll go and they'll consent and approve to these different Microsoft enterprise applications that allow them to do email backups for exfiltration. One of them is like EM client, right? That's another one that we see them use a lot for mail because it essentially immediately lets them pull out like all the emails and contact data. It also allows them to send emails, right? So when users are requesting different applications, it's definitely recommended that you have at least an admin approve it, but also that you're looking at what those permissions are, because whatever those permissions are is essentially what that application can do. And if it's a threat actor, they have access to do all of those different things on the Graph API via that application.
Yeah, generally we don't see them just like consent to like a few things, right? Like it's generally like read, write, all. I have access to everything through this. And then they leverage that to, perform that exfil. Think about it if you're like a healthcare organization, a law firm, there's a lot of sensitive information that may be passed back and forth between those things. So being able to exfiltrate that might be another form of, fraud that someone can use to extort you and say, hey, I've got all this information and all these emails, and I'm going to release it if you don't pay X amount of dollars, kind of thing. So really important to kind of think about from a cloud perspective how these compromises are ongoing, whether or not you have detection capabilities. And the thing I would say is have detection capabilities across all of these, right? You can see that Blackpoint kind of intercepts after the initial compromise, but we also alert on the exfiltration tools. We alert on, different inbox rules, things like that. Make sure you have that kind of like total depth of protection because, like I said, threat actors are constantly playing this cat and mouse game, and you don't want step one to fail and not have a few backup plans. It's always good to have a few of those backup plans just in case they can circumvent step one. You can catch them at step 2, 3, 4, etc. So I think this was a good kind of wrap up, of what we're currently seeing and kind of like business email compromise. Sam, anything else you'd like to kind of, raise up or double tap on at least before we move on to our next subject?
Yeah, I think just, in general, right, we're going to keep seeing different, the threat actors are going to continue to adapt, and this kind of like, I guess, sentiment reflects across all the things that we've talked about and we'll be talking about today. But just, a lot of these, they're using legitimate features, legitimate, portions of, whether it's the login page that they're relaying or the device code feature, ClickFix feature, like the runbox feature, those kind of things, right? So just making sure that like, although it's like a legitimate, legitimate source, it may not be legitimate activity.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, next up is something that kind of, I know, keeps a lot of our partners up at night, but we want to specifically talk about why MSPs are the perfect targets, right? We've talked about business email compromise and things like that. I want to pivot over to more of like the on-prem cloud infrastructure now and think about why our partners, they have to protect their end clients, but why should they really be focusing inward and really looking at their infrastructure and their capabilities because of the potential that we have here? So we had a really strong response for a partner that we protect that we're going to go over today. And we're really going to kind of go through these different steps and kind of dissect what this meant for the partner, what this meant for visibility, but also why all of this makes sense when you think about it from an attacker's perspective. So Nevin, I'll have you kick off the kill chain and kind of like a brief overview of what we saw actually happen within this MSP's environment and how this potentially, was the start of something potentially even worse before further involvement.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing to think about is why, again, the question posed is why are MSPs sort of the golden target, I would say, within the threat actor aspect of things. And it all ties down to trust. So there's the trust aspect within, hey, the MSP has these set procedures, or for trusted access into, say, your client network, there's SSL VPNs, there's utilization of RMMs, there's going to be some shape or form of trust within the network to allow legitimate activity to go on. Threat actors want to go after this trust because, again, this trust is what lets them sort of move around in the network in a undetected manner in order to sort of work towards their action on objectives. So in this initial kill chain, we started alerting to execution stemming from the RMM on the end clients. So again, they're leveraging a trusted platform to remotely execute across client environments. When we start working backward and asking those contextual questions of like, okay, we see the executions happening on the client network. How is it happening in a bigger picture aspect? So answering those questions of who, what, when, where, why, how, we then discover a piece of malware we deem Roadkill. It is a reverse tunneling implant that the threat actor leveraged to call home to C2. Following that sort of breadcrumb, working backwards as well, we then identified the deployment of a piece of software called NESA Monitoring Agent. This is a legitimate like software monitoring platform that threat actors frequently abuse for sort of initial or persistence in the network because it does allow you to execute commands, but it also allows you to like, hey, I have a sort of home base that I can see the server, the software is deployed on, and then also remotely execute commands on it in a sort of obscure way on this specific device. And then also working backwards, you sort of put all the pieces together and say like, hey, how did the threat actor get into the network, and then sort of work their way towards the very far right of the kill chain. We identified a externally exposed SSL VPN, which sort of caused the start of this ongoing compromise.
Yeah. And I'd like to really point out, like, of these 4 things that are up here, 1 is a new implant that we did research on, and 3 of them are exactly the same things that we've discussed about like in previous cases, but also that we discussed at the very beginning of this webinar, right? SSL VPN compromise tied to remote monitoring and rogue management solutions, right? So that initial access through the VPN, the deployment of the NESA monitoring agent, so that way they could kind of start some persistence, have that kind of like a live pulse of the device. They drop their deployment toolkit with Roadkill, which we're going to go a little bit more in depth on because I know some of you are coming here from the Roadkill blog that we recently released. And then finally, they're finding those RMM API keys. So Nevin, why is that the kind of catalyst to this kind of like fire, right? Like why are those RMM API keys kind of like keys to the kingdom when we come across this type of stuff?
Absolutely. So again, it's leveraging trusted access. So hey, they have an RMM API key. They then can access the RMM, and once they're in the RMM, they can start sort of executing downstream. So the reason they're targeting the MSP is like, hey, if I can compromise the MSP and get access to either their RMM platform or access into something that in their environment that allows access into these client networks, it sort of scales that compromise very quickly. So instead of just, hey, I have access and can compromise one specific organization, that organization through an MSP now goes to the MSP and its clients. So it scales it from 1 to say like 40, 30, 50, however many end clients that are sort of associated with that specific MSP organization.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we talk about ROI as an attacker, right, it's great to get ROI from a single end customer, but think about the ROI I get when I have access to multiple things, right? It really kind of harkens back to supply chain compromise, right? When we talk about those kind of things and the access that they provide. So definitely interesting to kind of think about these attack chains specifically for our MSP partners and why they're so valuable and sought after for the attackers because of the access that they provide. But before we dive deeper into what potentially the downstream impact of this could look like, I really wanted to give a chance for us to kind of talk a little bit more about Roadkill. And the kind of deployment and how that's used and what that kind of means as we see different things leveraged, different custom implants being built, that kind of thing. Shout outs to the team for naming it Roadkill. I think it's kind of hilarious. We named it Roadkill because it beacons to vulture infrastructure. So, I always wanted the chance to be able to name something. So it's great to see us, kind of providing this insights and these additional, payloads and things like that we can highlight for our partners. But Nevin, one of the things I want to do is so for everyone on the call, right, we have a full blog that does a complete deep dive. If you want to really nerd out with us and go all the way down to what this thing's executing at the different stages and how it's leveraged, please check out that blog. But at the same time, we do want to keep it a little bit higher level here, so that way we can, have enough time to get through everything that we want today. So Nevin, let's talk a little bit about like what this WebSocket-based pivoting implant looks like and why was it unique at the time when we saw it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Roadkill, high level, is a reverse tunneling implant. So its main functionality is, hey, it's going to phone home via WebSocket connection to that vulture command and control. What's interesting with it is it's not your typical like reverse tunneling implant. It's very lightweight. I think the JavaScript file was like 40, 50 lines in total compared to a lot of these standard tools. There's always going to be a client and a listener. Roadkill is just by itself. It also does, how this implant works is it built a custom protocol with 5 specific command vocabulary within that protocol. So we have the data that's being sent back and forth. So think of the data as just a raw network traffic. There's the connect, which sets up a new connection. Its connected terminology within the vocab is when a connection is set up, the connected goes back to the C2, so the threat actor knows that, hey, I now have access to this new segmented host. Close is when the channel is killed, and then error is when there's some sort of failure within setting up this new channel. Bigger picture aspect of it, it's focusing on becoming a gateway into the internal network. So, hey, a threat actor compromises an organization, they deploy Roadkill calls home to that command and control from that sort of beachhead host, and then leveraging Roadkill, they're able to tunnel and open up specific ports via the vocabulary and via the specific implant to start moving laterally within the segmented portions of the end organizations.
Awesome. Yeah. So we got this kind of like brokerage, right? Instead of one-way communication, it's able to kind of broker these things across the environment and help us to really dig in further as a threat actor to leverage kind of across that internal network, and be kind of like a true relay point as well. So why does this matter further, right? Let's talk a little bit about kind of like how this execution occurs and what this really means at a broader level for the operator that's leveraging Roadkill.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the graph, we're going to take this as like, hey, I'm the operator. I'm on this Vultr command and control or the specific relay. The operator's issuing these commands. So, hey, once Roadkill is calling home, they can issue commands for specific ports they want to open via TCP. Those ports are then opened on so command goes through the relay. Relay goes to the host infected with the Roadkill implant, and then say I want to open port 3389 on that segmented internal server. I would send a connect command with the port and that specific server IP to open that port. That sort of that traffic gets sent from Roadkill to that server. The port is then opened. Traffic comes back, and it's more of a relay tunneling aspect of allowing the threat actor to touch these specific ports. And it's a way to stay very under the radar due to the nature of how lightweight this specific Node.js-based malware piece is, as well as sort of the functionality of it's stupid simple. So again, there's not a lot to it, but again, focusing on the stupid simple concepts of just leveraging WebSockets and TCP to sort of relay traffic and sort of tunneling throughout internal networks allows it to remain under the radar and sort of help the operator work towards their action on objectives.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely, a unique tool, but again, what we've been kind of talking about all day, right? Like these aren't super advanced things that we're seeing, right? Like we are building things that just work because all we really need them to do is just work and hope that no one's monitoring to catch this kind of stuff. So it's interesting to see how keeping it simple is generally good because we can fly potentially under the radar if someone's not watching. For those of you on the call, oh, go ahead.
A
Jason,
lot of AV like looks for obfuscation and such, right? Whereas this is just kind of keeping it very simple. It hides with a lot of the legitimate like listeners and tunnels that are running on your computer, like the basic traffic that's happening.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, for those of you that are interested in kind of reading more about Roadkill and this implant, we did drop the link for this blog in the QA, so you all can navigate directly to that and be able to kind of read more as well to dive just a little bit further. But since this implant was used in this kind of like initial compromise of the MSP, now we really want to focus on like why this matters further after an MSP breach, right? And like, what does this look like downstream for all the potential customers that maybe are now impacted because of this cloud-hosted RMM that has the ability to execute, right? So this threat actor has gained access to this RMM solution, and now they basically have the same access an MSP has in order to start executing and delivering things as well. So Nevin, can we talk a little bit about this kill chain downstream and why this matters so much for our partners when the potential compromise starts upstream?
Absolutely. So the focus on the upstream, they have the upstream access. Why it matters downstream is the nature of, okay, they have that trusted platform. They have this cloud hosted RMM. They're able to remotely execute and access devices throughout all the downstream environments. So again, from the threat actor, instead of, hey, I have to compromise 18 different SSL VPNs, I have to compromise 18 different externally facing applications to get into each organization. Instead of doing that one by one, now they just have to hit the upstream MSP, get access to some sort of the tooling that allows them to access these downstream networks, and then they can remotely execute onto these impacted end hosts within the downstream client network. The commands we see is like, hey, they can go ahead and do whatever they need to do towards their action on objectives. They can remotely execute on the host. They can open up RDP onto these hosts and sort of work their way for finding data, finding specific pieces of information that they're looking for, and or establishing some form of persistence into the network to allow them to sort of work towards getting access back in and or selling that access off in the client network as well.
Yeah. So what turns into a potential nightmare becomes multiple nightmares, right? When the partner conversation starts, we're generally talking about one client, But when the partner is the source of truth for the compromise, now we're talking many clients, right? And so again, that goes back to that like ROI for the attacker, right? Where, now I haven't just compromised one place, I have the potential to compromise multiple places and be able to leverage that access for ROI on all of those individual, tenants that I'm able to execute on. Rathbun, do you want to talk a little bit around kind of like how Blackpoint takes the approach for lateral movement into these environments and why lateral movement is kind of like a quick key indicator for these types of attacks?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So lateral movement is essentially something that has been kind of like quintessential to attacks. Essentially, once you get into a network, the operator's job is then to gain access to more machines, or at least enough machines to be able to cause enough impact to where they'll more likely get the payment from the victims, right? So what we see is we record like all the lateral movement in the environment, right? Whether that's admin RDPs, remote executions using different services like Service Control Manager. Sometimes we see them use like PowerShell remoting via WinRM. So there's a lot of different ways in Windows that is just normal kind of service traffic that they can try to blend in with, right? So what we're doing is we're looking at what's that differentiation, right? How do the threat actors like to pivot through the network versus how your inventory collection tool acts in the network, right? So we're making these differentiations along with bringing that context of what accounts typically do it, when do those accounts typically do it, right? We're looking at the differentiations in these things to determine what's anomalous. And our analysts are reviewing when this does happen to see what is the actual outcome of these like privileged remote executions or this admin RDP, right? Because a lot of the time what we'll see is their main goal is either getting it's a few things. The domain controller is a big one because then they can just modify your group policy to ransom all the machines. Sometimes they'll try to get to the backup server prior to either corrupt your backups. Hopefully you have immutable backups, but a lot of the time they'll try and get to that. And what we see also is the backups are not only something that they want to destroy, but it's a great place for them to get credentials, SQL in general, right? So trying to kind of control the whole environment so that when they do take that last action of ransomware or exfiltration, if it's going to be ransomware, they'll do the exfiltration first. But yeah, that's their end goal, is how can I control the most machines to have the most impact, whether that's domain controller or slowly pivoting to each machine on the network to have system level access to it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's a good kind of overview of what we saw and some of the things to consider as an MSP yourself. You are kind of the keys to the kingdom when you have those kind of RMM tools and capabilities to be able to execute downstream. So, definitely make sure you're thinking about some of the same things that we're talking about on this call within your own internal environment, along with your end customers as well. Last but not least, we did want to kind of briefly talk about the annual threat report. So this is live now. We'll drop a link directly to the report in the Q&A as well. But I did want to kind of, again, focus on, 2025 was a big year for growth and change and things like that. But we also saw, this buildup of these legitimate, trusted tools being leveraged in order to really gain access and kind of execute in customers' environments. So the first one here is not going to be a surprise because, again, our ATR aligns directly with these things that we're talking about right now. So out of all of the incidents we responded to, this is a good breakdown of the different things that we saw. And again, it's no surprise, but the top three things are the things that we've talked about today, we talked about last month, and are on our kind of like hot actions for initial access, right? So FakeCaptcha and ClickFix, almost 60% of incidents we saw leverage some form of verification prompt that was either ClickFix, FakeFix, those types of FakeCaptcha type attacks, because they were so effective at luring those users into executing those malicious payloads on their own systems. Again, we evolved from, me having to drop something on the endpoint and get a user to execute it to just giving it to the user and having it execute themselves. Again, following up on those kind of like top three trends, SSL VPN use and RMM abuse are another third each around how those things look. And if you're looking at this and saying, Jason, wait a second, that's more than 100%, right? Well, that's because these things chained with each other. As we saw with that MSP abuse, you know, an SSL VPN was used, then the RMM was abused. We see that a lot with, you know, customer environments as well. SSL VPN abuse is the initial access. They drop a rogue RMM tool for persistence and access, and then they start executing and towards their objectives. So again, really looking at kind of like those network edge devices, that's still a critical bridge, right? It's a critical bridge for us because we need to be able to leverage them to remotely monitor, manage. You know, maybe your end customers need to access those SSL VPNs for remote work and things like that, but they provide that same value to the attacker as well. So those SSL VPNs that are publicly exposed have login pages that are pretty unrestricted. You know, threat actors are scanning for those types of things to kind of understand where they lie, and then to see what they can abuse on those VPN panels to be able to gain access. And then the big thing there is when they gain access to a user, they look like that user, right? So if I log into an SSL VPN, it says Jason Barnheiser's logged in, and when I start moving around the network, someone may look at that and think, oh, that's just Jason. But we take it a step further with that identity and kind of do that contextual and behavioral analysis that layers on top of it to say, wait a second, Jason only works 9 to 5 and he's logged in at 11 o'clock p.m. and he's executing these things. Like something's wrong here, right? Something's outside of the norm. And then the same thing with RMM abuse. We're still seeing those legitimate remote monitoring and management tools being leveraged. Screen Connect was one of the largest ones we saw because of the free trial aspect of Screen Connect, and it allows you to be able to gain some of that capabilities and deliver these things as that pseudo command and control within an environment that a traditional EDR AV may never flag because of how those things are legitimately used in environments. So for my team here, I'll open it up to you all for any quick like double taps or comments you guys want to provide kind of on some of these key metrics.
Yeah, I think the chaining of them is one of the things to hammer home, right? Like when you look at it and you see this is over 100%, right? These are like bar none the top 3 things that we're seeing. They're being used in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, it's like the FakeCaptcha installs a trial of an RMM, right? And then the RMM itself is defense evasion, command and control, persistence. Whereas before the FakeCaptcha code itself would kind of have to establish like scheduled task or a run key, etc., right? But why do that when you can just use legitimate software?
Yeah. Sort of. I was gonna say the last thing for me is it again, all 3 tie into trust in some shape or form. Trusting the platforms that they're leveraging, the trusted access into internal networks, and then the trusted tools deployed within the organization. So again, it's the abuse of trust that's allowing threat actors to move illicitly throughout these different networks.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, right? Like we could literally just take all these 3, smash them all together and say, what did you view the most? And we could say the abuse of trust, right? The abuse of those trusted relationships and legitimate tools and access was something that we really saw take off. Next up, I did want to kind of talk a little bit about like impacted industries. And, you know, I think the top 2 here are no surprise, but it's that third one that I really want to kind of like focus on, right? It's you know, the MSPs themselves. So over the course of 2025, all of our observed incidents were kind of bucketed down into the verticals and impacted industries that we saw. Manufacturing came out on top. You know, generally manufacturing is difficult because there's a lot of constraints internally. You can't allow for downtime, so updates and things like that are more difficult. Healthcare is very highly targeted because, you know, the impact it can have, right? Shutting down healthcare operations and things like that is a quick way to get, you know, that ROI as an attacker because those things have to get back up and running, and we see those ransoms paid out. But the third one is really where I wanted to kind of focus here is the MSPs themselves. coming in third place over 2025. And that's kind of like a key indicator of how these threat actors are taking more notice of the leverage that these types of environments have on that downstream impact. So Nevin, any other comments around kind of like why MSPs really need to be on guard and what that really means for them moving into 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. They're always going to be highly targeted due to that downstream portion of things. So again, why compromise 18 different hosts instead of just compromising one to get all access to 19? So if any way to speed up the efficiency, sort of to speed up the ROI of their investment into these different attacks that threat actors are putting in place, they're targeting these specific end organizations that allow for downstream effects of, hey, they want to push out payloads, things of that nature, in a more efficient way to gain access to work towards their action on objectives, whether that's data, encryption, things of that nature.
Yeah. And then last but not least, I wanted to kind of shine a light on this stat specifically, and get kind of like some feedback from you, Jason, on this, because I know our detection engineering team works tirelessly to build custom detections and really work to build out what we do here at Blackpoint. But this stat I really thought was very interesting. 72% of the time that we responded to an incident, there were no other EDR agents, AV solutions alerting to anything before Blackpoint was already involved. So can you talk a little bit about how we're engineering things a little differently at Blackpoint that allows us to really get involved before like a traditional EDR AV solution does?
Yeah, we have several different ways. One is the collaboration that we do with our adversary pursuit group, which is our threat intelligence and threat research, right? So they feed us a lot of insight in terms of what's happening kind of through open source intelligence or the dark web and what they're seeing there, right? A lot of it also is that we have a full detection engineering team, and our detection engineers also have offensive experience, right? So they're not just creating detections and waiting to see them hit. They're testing tradecraft and then seeing what comes in through our agent and creating detections around the data that we're collecting. So we're not only creating detections, we're testing tradecraft and then creating detections around it. Same goes for incidents, right? Our MDR team is responding to these incidents all the time. So as we're seeing new things being added to the chain, we're ensuring that our detections we have currently are covering it. And we're also building our detections in a way to where we're looking for the tradecraft, not necessarily one specific part of that tradecraft, right? How can we catch it kind of going forward so that if they change some of the things that we typically see them change, so, say like a scheduled task name, we're not looking for that. We're looking for how is the larger picture here of like the staging being done. So that allows us to be very accurate in this sense of looking at the actual tradecraft. And a lot of our detections also, since we have that offensive mentality, is we're looking at what they're doing now and we're kind of future thinking, what are they going to do next, right? What would an offensive or a pen tester maybe do next from this point? And that's why we also have a bunch of detections that haven't yet fired, but we know once they do that it's going to be malicious.
Yeah, those initial indicators are so key. You don't want to wait for there to be a boom or, some sort of execution in the environment. You want to catch that stuff as that threat actor is staging and laterally moving from the get-go. Awesome. Well, as many of you know that have met me before, I could talk about this kind of stuff all day, but that does reach kind of the end of our presentation for today. I want to thank everyone that came out. I saw quite a few familiar names and faces and things like that. But for those of you, if you're new and want to learn more about Blackpoint, we do have a QR code here if you're interested in a potential free trial that will take you to our sign-up pages and things like that to be able to kind of take a look at Blackpoint a little bit deeper and talk to someone internally as well. So I do want to thank everyone for coming out. We will definitely see you all next month. And for my peers on the call here and to all of you, I hope everyone has a great week. Welcome to Q2, and I hope everyone has a good month. Thanks, everyone.